Hi, everyone. Quick one for you. Make sure you subscribe and like before we start. Thank you. My life at first glance is simple, almost perfect. I wake up every morning at 6:30, brew a pot of coffee, and sit quietly on the back porch, letting the calm of dawn to wash over me. It's my ritual before the chaos of the day begins, my time to collect my thoughts. Lauren is usually still asleep, buried in the covers, her soft breathing the only sound in the otherwise silent house. Ella, our daughter, is always the first to stir, padding down the hallway in her slippers, still clutching her stuffed rabbit. She's 7 and loves her routines as much as I do. This has been my life for years: work, home, family, stable, comfortable, or so it seemed. Lately, though, something's been off. It's hard to explain, but there's a distance, an almost imperceptible gap growing between Lauren and me. She's always been driven, focused on her career in marketing, but these days it's more than that. Late nights at the office, meetings that seem to stretch into dinners, and her phone, always buzzing, always just out of sight. She brushes it off as work, and I've never been the type to pry. Trust, after all, is the foundation of any good marriage. But trust, I'm realizing, is fragile. It started small: a missed dinner here, an unexplained meeting there. I told myself it was just the nature of her job. She's busy, successful. But then there were the text messages. The ones she was quick to swipe away, her fingers moving just a bit too fast to be natural. When I asked, she'd smile, brush it off with a vague explanation about clients or coworkers, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. One night we were having dinner, just the two of us. Ella was already asleep and the house was quiet. Lauren's phone vibrated on the counter, and I caught a glimpse of the screen. It was a name I hadn't seen before: Ron. The message was brief, a simple, "Looking forward to tomorrow." Before I could ask, she grabbed the phone, turning it over as she smiled at me. That same thin-lipped smile that now seemed more like a barrier than an expression. "Who's Ron?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, not wanting to sound suspicious. She didn't miss a beat. "Oh, just someone from work. We're collaborating on a new project." I nodded, but something in my gut twisted. Days passed, but the feeling lingered. I found myself watching her more closely. Lauren was always on her phone, texting someone, but whenever I entered the room, she'd stop. It wasn't obvious at first, just subtle shifts, the way she'd put it down a second too quickly, or how she'd offer vague, non-committal answers when I asked about her day. There were the late nights, too. She had a big campaign coming up, or so she said, and meetings kept running long. One night I decided to test it. I called her office at 8 p.m., a time she'd said she'd be working late. The receptionist answered, and when I asked to speak to Lauren, there was a pause. "I'm sorry," the woman said. "She left a few hours ago." I hung up without saying anything. That night, Lauren came home around 10, wearing the same tired smile she'd been offering for weeks. She kissed me on the cheek and mumbled something about a long meeting, about how she couldn't wait to collapse into bed. I watched her walk up the stairs, every step heavy with the weight of my growing suspicion. I didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, I let it simmer. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was all in my head. But each day, more inconsistencies appeared. Missed calls, unexplained absences, dinners with clients that didn't line up with her calendar, and then there was Ella. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she hesitated, looking at me with those wistful, innocent eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, "I saw Mommy with Uncle Ron." My heart stopped. I kept my voice calm, measured. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Ella bit her lip, nervous, as if she was saying something forbidden. "Mommy told me not to tell you. She said it was a secret." I felt something cold settle deep inside me. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was real. I kissed Ella goodnight, told her everything would be okay, but as I walked out of her room, I felt a shift within myself. The life I'd built, the routines I'd cherished, were built on a lie. My mind was already racing, forming plans, considering every angle. I wouldn't confront Lauren, not yet. I would wait, gather information, and when the time was right, I would act. Revenge wouldn't come in a burst of anger. It would be cold, calculated, and thorough. She wouldn't see it coming, but she would feel it. I returned home earlier than expected that day, the quiet hum of the city fading behind me as I unlocked the door to an empty house. Lauren's car wasn't in the driveway, which was unusual. I hadn't heard from her since morning. There was always some meeting or work dinner, the excuses blending into one another over the last few months. I had come to expect her absence more than her presence, though it still left a bitter taste in my mouth. As I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter, I noticed her phone sitting there face down. She rarely left it behind. A small part of me wondered if this was an opportunity to dig further, to confirm what I was starting to suspect. But I stopped myself. I wasn't going to be the paranoid husband, not yet. The phone wasn't mine to touch, and I wasn't ready to confront her, not without proof. Instead, I poured a glass of water and sat at the table, staring at the device as though it might reveal something just by existing in the same room. Then the front door opened. I stayed seated, watching Lauren step in, carrying her briefcase. She smiled, but her eyes were tired, distracted. Her lipstick was slightly smudged. I felt something tighten in my chest. "You're home early," she said, surprised but casual. Her tone was off, just a little too breezy. "Yeah, finished up quicker than expected," I replied. "Where were you?" She hesitated just for a second, then said, "Client meeting ran late." I nodded, watching her carefully. She moved around the kitchen, setting her things down, avoiding eye contact. "How was the meeting?" "Good. Productive." I kept my expression neutral, but inside the pieces were clicking into place. I knew she was lying. It was in the way she fidgeted with her purse strap, her voice a little too controlled. I could sense the disconnection between us, the widening gap that had been forming for weeks. I had hoped I was wrong, but the tension I'd been feeling wasn't paranoia. Something had shifted in her, and now I was sure of it. But this wasn't the moment to confront her. I needed more. The impulse to act, to demand answers, was there, but I crushed it down. I couldn't risk an emotional reaction. I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. Later that night, I lay in bed next to her, listening to the soft sound of her breathing. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Every late-night work meeting, every unexplained absence, every moment of distraction, all of it replayed in my head, forming a picture that was becoming clearer by the second. She was having an affair. I didn't need to hear it from her lips to know. I could feel the truth creeping into every part of me. The next day, I decided to leave work early again. This time, though, I didn't go straight home. I went to Lauren's office, something I hadn't done in a long time. I parked in the lot across the street, watching as employees trickled out. I waited, patient, blending into the background. My eyes scanned the building, tracking each person that exited. Around 7 p.m., she walked out. Not alone. She was with a man, tall, well-dressed, with dark hair and a confident, easy stride. I didn't need to be told who he was. It had to be Ron, the name I'd seen flash on her phone more than once. I watched them laugh, standing too close to one another. His hand brushed her back, a gesture that felt too familiar, too intimate. They walked to a nearby bar. I stayed in the car, parked at a distance, my breath steady as I observed them. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to walk inside, to confront her, to tear her and this man apart with words. But I wouldn't give in to that rage. No, if I was going to act, it would be on my terms. I followed them as they left the bar, noting how comfortable they seemed together. They drove off in his car, and I stayed behind, my fists clenched tightly around the steering wheel. I didn't need to follow them further to know where they were going. The truth was enough to solidify my next steps. That night, I sat alone in my study, a plan forming in my mind. I had been wronged, humiliated, but I wouldn't let emotion guide me. Revenge had to be calculated, precise. Confrontation was too simple, too short-lived. If I was going to take my life back, I had to dismantle hers carefully, piece by piece. I thought about Ella, how she'd mentioned Ron's name before, how Lauren had tried to make her complicit in the secret. My anger deepened, not just for myself, but for what Lauren was dragging our daughter into. I would not allow her to manipulate Ella the way she had manipulated me. My next step was to gather information. It was no longer enough to suspect. I needed confirmation, hard evidence that would give me the upper hand. Over the next few days, I began monitoring Lauren closely. I installed a discreet tracking app on her phone, one that would give me access to her texts, emails, and location in real time. I also placed a small camera in our bedroom, hidden inside a picture frame on her side of the bed. The first few days yielded little. Lauren maintained her usual routine: work, coming home late, spending time with Ella in the evenings. But on the third night, I hit pay dirt. A string of messages between her and Ron, explicit in nature, plans to meet again the following evening. My stomach twisted, but I felt no surprise. The proof was right in front of me now, confirming what I'd already known. That evening, when she came home late, I didn't mention the messages. I didn't ask where she'd been. I simply kissed her goodnight and went to sleep, knowing full well where she had spent the last few hours. But now I was armed with the truth, and with that came control. As the weeks passed, I continued to gather more. Emails, phone calls, every move she made with Ron cataloged and stored. I kept all of it to myself, never confronting her, never letting on that I knew. Every detail I collected was another piece of the puzzle, another step toward my ultimate goal. Lauren had no idea that her every lie, every betrayal, was being recorded. I studied them both. Ron, it turned out, wasn't nearly as careful as Lauren thought. He had a wife, a high-paying job, and a reputation to protect. He wouldn't want any of this getting out. I filed that information away, knowing it would be useful later. Lauren had no idea how deeply I was entrenched in her double life. She carried on as if everything were normal, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath her feet was beginning to shift. She laughed with Ella, made plans for the future, and all the while I watched, waiting for the perfect moment to set my plan into motion. The time for confrontation would come, but not yet. For now, I would let her think she was still in control, let her believe that her secrets were safe. But in the end, everything would come crashing down around her, and I would be the one to light the match. I wasn't going to just expose her. I was going to destroy her, and I would do it slowly, methodically, with the same precision I applied to every aspect of my life. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet observation and careful preparation. I had made my decision. This would be an impulsive act of revenge. I would take my time, dissect every aspect of Lauren's life, and slowly unravel it, making sure she never suspected I was behind it all. The first step was gathering more information, solid proof of her affair, and every detail I could use to break her down. I started by installing a discreet camera in our bedroom, hidden in a vent that overlooked her side of the bed. It wasn't an easy task to do without her noticing, but I had time. She worked late more often than not, and I knew her schedule better than she thought I did. Within days, the camera began recording. It didn't take long before the footage confirmed everything I had suspected. Lauren didn't bother to hide her indiscretions at home. She made phone calls to Ron, sometimes whispering softly into the receiver, sometimes bold enough to talk normally when she thought I was out. There were moments when I came home early and found her in the shower or in bed, having just finished a phone call. I knew what had taken place in those moments, though she never let on. It was almost laughable how comfortable she had become in her deceit, like I had ceased to exist as a real presence in her life. I used that comfort to my advantage. The camera captured everything. I watched as she undressed before calls, heard her make plans with Ron, and even witnessed her texting him in bed beside me. Every time I caught another piece of evidence, I felt my resolve harden. But this wasn't enough. I needed more than a record of their affair. I needed ammunition, something that would hit her where it truly hurt. Lauren had always been fiercely protective of her career. She worked for a high-end marketing firm where her reputation and professional success were everything. That's where I would begin. I started by accessing her work laptop. She'd made it easy for me. She was careless, often leaving it open or unattended when she was home. It didn't take long for me to install a keylogger, capturing everything she typed, every email she sent, every message exchanged. I could track her every move from the comfort of my own office. She was good at hiding her affair in personal spaces, but her professional life left trails, and soon I had access to everything I needed. Ron wasn't just her lover, he was a co-worker. They collaborated on various projects together, often using work as a cover for their time spent alone. I started by gathering evidence of inappropriate conduct at the office, personal messages sent through company email, planning rendezvous during work hours. The professionalism she had prided herself on was just a facade, and I had enough to tear it apart. But this was only the first layer. I began to meticulously sabotage her work. It was subtle at first. I intercepted an important email that was meant for her boss, altering the attachments to appear incomplete and disorganized. The project she'd spent months on was delayed, and her boss reprimanded her for it. I watched her frustration mount, her confusion growing as she couldn't understand how such a mistake had occurred. I took satisfaction in seeing her unravel, knowing that this was just the beginning. Next, I manipulated her client relations. Lauren was known for being charming, persuasive. She had a way of winning people over. But I planted seeds of doubt. Using the access I had to her correspondence, I sent carefully crafted messages to key clients, making it seem like Lauren was becoming unreliable, aloof. Clients started pulling back, expressing dissatisfaction with her work. It wasn't enough to get her fired, not yet, but it was enough to tarnish her once flawless reputation. All the while, I remained the supportive husband. I asked how work was going, sympathized with her when she vented about the sudden problems she was facing. I pretended to be confused when she spoke of clients pulling away and projects falling apart. She suspected nothing. She had no idea that I was behind the slow collapse of her professional life. As the weeks passed, I turned my attention to her social circle. Lauren had always been popular, the kind of person who thrived in gatherings, always the center of attention at parties. But popularity was fragile, built on perception, and I knew how to manipulate that. I started by sowing subtle discord among her closest friends. It was easy enough. I used her phone while she was in the shower or when she left it unattended, sending cryptic messages to her friends that were just vague enough to be misunderstood. I made her seem unreliable, dismissive, and cold. One friend, Marissa, was particularly sensitive to perceived slights. It only took a few strategically placed texts to make her believe Lauren had been talking behind her back. Within days, the two weren't speaking, and Marissa began spreading rumors about Lauren's behavior. Soon enough, Lauren started losing her place in the social hierarchy she had worked so hard to maintain. Invitations to events dried up. Friends stopped texting as often. She noticed the shift, but couldn't understand it, wondering aloud why people seemed distant. I offered no answers, only the same supportive silence I'd been giving her for weeks. The more isolated she became, the deeper I drove the wedge. I used our finances to tighten the noose around her without her even realizing it. We had always kept joint accounts for household expenses and savings, but Lauren had her own investments, ones she guarded carefully. She had been funneling money into them for years, intending to build a safety net should anything happen to her career. I slowly drained those accounts, moving the funds into a series of private accounts she couldn't access. It wasn't enough to completely bankrupt her, but it was enough to create a financial strain. She would wake up one day to find the safety net she thought she had built was gone, and by then it would be too late to recover. Through it all, I maintained my facade. I played the role of the loving, if slightly distant, husband. Ella was my anchor, the reason I kept my rage in check. I made sure she was unaffected by the chaos that was slowly engulfing Lauren. Our mornings together remained the same, quiet moments before the storm of the day. I made sure to shield her from the worst of what was to come. Lauren, on the other hand, was beginning to crack. I watched as she grew more frustrated, more anxious, the calm confidence she once carried slipping away. She became erratic at work, snapping at colleagues, making mistakes she never would have made before. At home, she was distant, lost in her own turmoil, unaware that I was the architect of her downfall. I could see it in her eyes when she looked at me. There was a growing suspicion, but she couldn't place it. She didn't know where to direct her unease, didn't know that I had been pulling the strings all along. That was the beauty of it. She trusted me still, even as I dismantled everything she held dear. It was during one of her late-night phone calls with Ron that I made my next move. I had been listening in for weeks, monitoring their conversations, waiting for the perfect opportunity. And then it came. They were planning a weekend away together, something they had done before. But this time, I had all the details I needed. They would be leaving Friday afternoon, checking into a boutique hotel outside the city. Ron had booked the room under a pseudonym, thinking he was being clever. He wasn't. I called his wife. It was easy enough to find her contact information. Ron wasn't nearly as careful as he thought, and a few quick searches online led me to her social media accounts, where she openly posted about her life. Her name was Susan, and she had no idea her husband was cheating on her. I made sure she knew everything. I sent her the text messages between Lauren and Ron, the emails, the hotel reservation under his fake name. I told her exactly where they would be and when. The devastation in her response was palpable, but I felt nothing. This wasn't about her. This was about them. When the weekend came, I watched it unfold from a distance. Susan arrived at the hotel just as they checked in, catching them together in the lobby. The scene that followed was as explosive as I had anticipated. Lauren's perfect world, her carefully constructed lie, shattered in front of everyone. She was humiliated, not only in front of Ron's wife, but also in front of strangers. Ron tried to play it off, but it was over for him too. His career, his marriage, everything was falling apart in that single moment. Lauren came home that night disheveled, broken. She didn't speak to me, didn't even look at me. I pretended not to know what had happened, asking her if she was okay. She gave me a blank stare, unable to process the events that had unfolded. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. The next morning, I put the final part of my plan into motion. I had gathered everything. The emails, the financial discrepancies, the messages. I sent it all to her boss, anonymously, of course. The investigation into her conduct began immediately, and within days, Lauren was suspended from work. Her reputation, once untouchable, was now in tatters. She had nothing left. I watched her crumble. She spent days at home, barely speaking, unable to comprehend how her life had unraveled so completely. And still, she never suspected it was me. Even as everything fell apart around her, I remained the one constant, the one she believed would never betray her. I had dismantled her life, and she didn't even know it. It was time to finish this. The unraveling of Lauren's life continued slowly but surely. Everything was proceeding according to my plan, and she was none the wiser. I watched as she tried to hold on to the remnants of her career, social life, and self-image. Each time she reached for stability, I was there to pull the rug out from under her. I had already sabotaged one of her key projects, leaving her baffled and embarrassed in front of her boss. But that was just the beginning. Now it was time to escalate. The corporate world thrives on perception, and reputation is everything. I knew exactly how to attack that, undermining her professionally in ways that appeared unrelated to her personal life, but would leave a lasting impact. It started with a well-placed tip to the company's internal audit team. I discovered through my surveillance of her emails that Lauren had access to a fund meant for employee expenses. It didn't take much effort to create a fake trail suggesting she had misused those funds. It wasn't enough to be obvious, just enough to trigger a suspicion. I sent the anonymous tip from a burner account, detailing just enough inconsistencies to ensure they'd take the bait. Within days, the audit was underway. Lauren was blindsided. She had no idea how or why she was being investigated, and she couldn't figure out who had it in for her. I watched her panic grow as the auditors began asking questions she couldn't fully answer. At first, she dismissed it as an administrative error, certain it would blow over. But the investigation intensified, and soon whispers began circulating around the office. Her colleagues started keeping their distance, unsure if she was guilty of something or if they might be next on the chopping block. It wasn't enough to ruin her outright, but it was enough to taint her reputation. The confident, composed version of Lauren that had once commanded respect was now seen as a liability. Her position became precarious, and she had no idea how to stop the downward spiral. I could see the stress eating away at her, but she never confided in me. Our once normal conversations had dwindled into awkward exchanges. She was retreating inward, and I was her only anchor, an anchor she didn't realize was pulling her down. At home, I remained supportive, asking how work was going and pretending to be sympathetic when she vented her frustrations. But my emotional distance, though subtle, was palpable. She felt it too. I knew she was growing increasingly paranoid, but I never gave her a reason to suspect me. It was delicious watching her spin in circles, searching for answers while I stood right beside her. Socially, I continued to isolate her. Lauren had always prided herself on being well-connected, the life of every party, but those connections were fragile, easily manipulated. I had already planted the seeds of doubt among her closest friends, but now it was time to sever those ties for good. Using her phone, I sent carefully crafted messages to her friends, insinuating that Lauren had been talking behind their backs. I made sure the tone was just right, catty, dismissive, enough to make them question her loyalty. One by one, her friends stopped reaching out. Invitations to brunches and parties dried up, and she found herself more alone than ever. She tried reaching out, but by then, the damage had been done. They didn't trust her anymore. Her once tight social circle had been poisoned from within, and Lauren had no idea that I had orchestrated every bit of it. The more isolated she became, the easier it was to maintain my control. She spent more time at home, growing restless and anxious, her confidence eroding with every passing day. I could see it in her eyes, the uncertainty, the confusion. She was starting to question everything, but she never once suspected that I was behind it all. She was too busy trying to hold on to what little she had left. Ron, on the other hand, had been slipping out of her life as well. My next move was to exploit his vanity and his paranoia. Men like Ron thrive on their conquests, but they are also deeply insecure. I planted the idea that Lauren might be seeing someone else, someone new, someone younger. It was simple, really. A few text messages, sent from a burner phone late at night, cryptic enough to make him wonder. At first, Ron didn't seem to take the bait. He was too confident in his control over Lauren, but I kept pushing. But I left a hotel receipt in Lauren's purse, one that appeared to be from a weekend trip she hadn't taken with Ron. The name on the receipt was fake, of course, but it was enough to spark suspicion. It wasn't long before Ron started acting differently, becoming more distant, more accusatory. Lauren didn't understand the shift in his behavior. She tried to smooth things over, but Ron wasn't as invested in her as she had been in him. Their affair, which had once been passionate, began to deteriorate. Ron pulled away, and soon enough, he disappeared altogether, leaving Lauren alone to deal with the wreckage of her life. The final blow was the financial one. Lauren had always believed she was in control of our finances. We had joint accounts, but she maintained a separate investment portfolio, one she thought I didn't know about. She had been secretly funneling money into it for years, preparing her escape in case she ever needed it. But I had been watching her every move. I drained the accounts. It wasn't difficult to move the money into offshore accounts, ones she couldn't trace. By the time she realized what had happened, it was too late. She was financially ruined, her safety net ripped out from under her. I watched the panic in her eyes when she tried to access the funds and found them empty. She couldn't understand how it had happened, and she had no one to turn to for help. Her career was hanging by a thread, her friends had abandoned her, and now her financial independence was gone. Lauren was truly and utterly alone. The weekend after the financial collapse, she sat at the kitchen table staring at her phone in silence. I watched her from across the room, pretending to be engrossed in the newspaper. She hadn't spoken more than a few words to me all morning, and I could feel the weight of her despair pressing down on her. "Are you okay?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She didn't look up. "I don't know," she whispered. I nodded, folding the paper and setting it aside. "If you need to talk, I'm here." She glanced at me then, her eyes hollow and tired. "I don't even know where to start." I offered her a sympathetic smile. the same one I had been giving her for weeks. "We'll figure it out," I said, the words empty and meaningless, but she needed to hear them. She needed to believe that someone was still on her side. That night, as she lay in bed beside me, I put the final part of my plan into motion. It was time to destroy what was left of her professional life. I had spent weeks collecting evidence, emails, financial discrepancies, personal messages. I compiled everything into a neat, anonymous package and sent it to the board of directors at her company. The accusations were serious enough to trigger an immediate investigation, one that would leave no room for recovery. Lauren would be fired, disgraced, her reputation destroyed beyond repair. The following week, it happened. She came home early, her face pale and drawn. I knew what had happened before she even said a word. "They fired me," she whispered, collapsing onto the couch. "They think I don't know how they got that information, but they think I've been—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. I sat beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice soft and comforting. "We'll get through this." But we wouldn't. She was finished, and I had made sure of it. Over the next few days, Lauren barely left the house. She didn't eat, didn't speak, didn't do anything but stare blankly at the walls. She had lost everything: her career, her friends, her financial security. Even Ron had cut her off, leaving her with nothing but the wreckage of the life she had once cherished. I, on the other hand, felt no satisfaction. I had won. I had meticulously destroyed the woman who had betrayed me, but there was no sense of triumph. Instead, I felt empty, hollow. The rage that had fueled me for so long had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a cold, bitter void. In the end, it wasn't about Lauren, it was about me, about reclaiming control, about proving to myself that I was strong enough to survive her betrayal. But as I sat there watching the woman who had once been my wife dissolve into nothingness, I couldn't help but wonder if I had lost more than I had gained. Lauren wasn't the only one who had been destroyed. In my pursuit of revenge, I had become something else, someone else. The man I had been before, the man who had loved her, who had built a life with her, was gone. All that was left was silence. Lauren's life was already in shambles, but the final phase of my plan required more precision. The seeds of doubt had been planted at work, her friendships were in tatters, and her relationship with Ron had deteriorated to the point of collapse. She was unraveling, yet still clinging to the fragments of her old life. But I wasn't finished. The real humiliation was yet to come. To destroy someone so utterly, you don't simply chip away at them. You dismantle them piece by piece until they no longer recognize themselves. I had been patient, meticulously pulling apart her life, and now the stage was set for the final move. Ron had been suspicious of Lauren for weeks, ever since I planted evidence suggesting she was seeing someone else. Their relationship, once built on secrecy and excitement, had devolved into petty accusations and mistrust. Lauren's emotional stability was hanging by a thread, but she was still holding on to the idea that her career would be her salvation. That was where I would strike next. I knew Ron was growing increasingly paranoid, questioning Lauren's every move. I decided to push him over the edge. Using her phone, I sent a message to a fake number, one I'd created just for this occasion. The text was vague but suggestive, making it seem like Lauren was planning to meet with someone new. It was enough to plant a final seed of doubt in Ron's mind. I knew his ego couldn't handle the idea of Lauren moving on from him, not after everything they had shared. He would react, and he would react publicly. Meanwhile, I had been gathering more ammunition from her work accounts. It was no longer enough to have her colleagues question her abilities. I wanted her entire professional life to implode, to make sure she couldn't recover. I began collecting every email that could be misconstrued, every meeting note that could be taken out of context. The beauty of Lauren's downfall was that it was all based on truths, twisted and manipulated, yes, but real enough that no one would question their validity. The night before my plan was to come to fruition, I sat in my office reviewing everything one last time. The emails, the financial discrepancies, the fake messages between her and Ron, it was all laid out, ready to be deployed. I had hacked into her work server days ago, giving me access to her most sensitive files. All I needed was one final push to send it all spiraling out of control. The next morning, as Lauren left for work, I sent the files anonymously to her company's board of directors. The accusations were damning. Embezzlement, inappropriate relationships with clients, mismanagement of major accounts. They would be forced to investigate, and I knew the outcome would be inevitable. She would be fired, and her reputation would be destroyed beyond repair. I had arranged for the climax of my plan to coincide with an important company event, a quarterly meeting that Lauren was set to attend, along with key executives and board members. I knew they would confront her there, in front of everyone, making her public humiliation complete. The meeting took place in a high-rise downtown, an imposing building made of steel and glass, fitting for the downfall of someone who once considered herself untouchable. I didn't go, of course, but I made sure to position myself in a nearby cafe, close enough to watch from a distance as it all unfolded. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind of day that would seem too bright for the dark turn Lauren's life was about to take. I watched as she walked into the building, her posture rigid, her expression tight. She didn't know what was coming, but I could sense her anxiety from across the street. She had been unraveling for weeks, and now she was walking straight into the final storm I had prepared for her. Inside, the meeting began as usual. Lauren was supposed to give a presentation on a new project, one she had been working on for months. It was meant to be her comeback after the whispers of incompetence had begun circulating through the office. But that presentation would never happen. At precisely 10:15 a.m., the board received the email. The room fell silent as the executives opened their laptops and read through the damning evidence I had sent them. I could only imagine the looks on their faces as they saw the emails implicating Lauren in financial misconduct, the records of her personal messages with clients, the innuendos about her affair with Ron. It was all there, meticulously timed to hit them during the most crucial moment of the meeting. Lauren had no idea what was happening at first. She was likely sitting at the front of the room preparing to speak when the first murmurs started. Then the questions began. I knew how these corporate meetings worked. Someone would ask for clarification, and then more voices would join in. Confusion would turn to suspicion, and suspicion would turn to outright accusation. It wouldn't take long for them to start connecting the dots, and once they did, Lauren's career would be over. I didn't need to be in the room to know what was happening. It was all playing out exactly as I had planned. Half an hour later, I saw her emerge from the building. She looked shattered. Her usual confidence, the poise she had relied on for years, was gone. She walked with her head down, her steps unsteady. I knew she had been fired. The humiliation would be too much for her to handle, and there would be no salvaging her reputation after this. I watched her stumble to her car, hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. She didn't drive away immediately. Instead, she sat there, staring blankly at the steering wheel. I wondered if she was thinking about everything she had lost, her career, her reputation, Ron. Maybe she was wondering how it had all gone so wrong so quickly. Maybe she was starting to realize that someone had been behind it all, orchestrating her downfall with precision and care. But she didn't suspect me. She couldn't. I had made sure of that. By the time she returned home that evening, she was a ghost of the woman she had once been. She barely spoke as she entered the house, moving through the rooms like a shadow. Ella was at a friend's house for the night, so there was no one but me to witness Lauren's complete collapse. She finally sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space in front of her. I stood across the room watching her. The silence between us was heavy, almost suffocating. I could tell she was trying to find the words to explain what had happened, but there was nothing she could say. "I got fired today," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded as if I was hearing it for the first time. "I'm sorry." She didn't cry. She didn't lash out. She just sat there, completely defeated. For a moment, I almost felt something close to pity. Almost. They said I was involved in something illegal," she continued, her eyes glazed over. "They said there were emails, records. I don't understand how—" Her voice trailed off as she stared at her hands, which were shaking uncontrollably. They're wrong, I said, stepping closer, my tone soft, almost soothing. You didn't do anything. She looked up at me then, her eyes searching mine for some kind of comfort, some kind of answer. But I gave her nothing. I don't know what to do, she said, her voice breaking. Everything is gone, my job, my friends, Ron. There it was, the crack I had been waiting for. She had lost everything, and she was finally realizing it. I could have told her then. I could have revealed everything, the surveillance, the sabotage, the messages. I could have watched the full weight of her betrayal crash down on her as she understood exactly what I had done to her. But I didn't. Instead, I sat down across from her, reaching out to take her hand. You'll get through this, I said, the words hollow even as I spoke them. She shook her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I don't think I can. The silence that followed was absolute. Over the next few days, Lauren withdrew further into herself. She barely left the house, barely spoke, barely ate. I watched her unravel, bit by bit, until there was nothing left of the woman who had once seemed so strong, so confident. I didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected. The victory I had worked so hard for, the revenge I had meticulously planned, felt hollow. Watching Lauren fall apart was like watching a slow-motion car crash. I had been behind the wheel, steering her toward destruction, but now that it had happened, all I could see was the wreckage. Ron, of course, had abandoned her completely. After the confrontation at the hotel and the subsequent fallout, he had severed all ties. He was likely trying to salvage his own career, his own marriage, and Lauren was nothing more than collateral damage. The day after her firing, I heard her on the phone with him, pleading for some kind of explanation, some kind of reconciliation. He didn't give her any. His voice was cold, detached, and when he hung up, she collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. I stood in the doorway watching her fall apart, and for the first time I felt nothing. I had won. I had destroyed her, and now, standing in the ashes of her life, I wondered what it had all been for. Was this truly the justice I had wanted, or had I lost something more valuable in the process? Lauren had betrayed me, yes, but in my pursuit of revenge, I had become something else, something colder, more calculating. The man I had been before, the man who had loved her, was gone. All that remained was silence. The day of Lauren's reckoning arrived with the same calm precision I had planned for months. I had chosen the setting carefully, a work function, one of those meticulously organized events her company held quarterly, where clients and executives mingled over champagne and presentations. Lauren had always thrived in those environments, using her charm and ambition to climb the corporate ladder. Today, that ladder would crumble beneath her, and I would be there to watch. I sat in my office early that morning staring at the array of emails and documents I'd compiled over the weeks. Each one meticulously crafted, a carefully edited chain of evidence that would expose Lauren's affair with Ron to her colleagues, clients, and supervisors. I had hacked into her work server and planted the evidence in a way that would seem entirely credible. The nature of their relationship, the inappropriate use of company resources, and even a few strategically placed rumors about financial mismanagement, everything was set to detonate at the perfect moment. I didn't need to be there to witness the fallout directly. I knew exactly how it would unfold. I had learned long ago that public humiliation, especially in professional settings, was a far more potent weapon than personal confrontation. In that room, surrounded by her peers and colleagues, her carefully constructed image would shatter, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. As the time for the event approached, I could almost feel the tension in the air. I watched from my phone, tracking her movements through the spyware I had installed on her device weeks ago. She arrived at the venue, greeted by the same familiar faces, blissfully unaware of what was about to happen. Her confidence was still intact, though frayed at the edges from the stress of the past few weeks. But by the end of the day, everything would change. The first wave hit just as the event began. An anonymous email from a concerned employee was sent to her supervisor and several key executives, including the CEO. It outlined the inappropriate relationship between Lauren and Jen. Lauren and Ron, complete with compromising photos and email exchanges that left no doubt about their affair. The second email, sent minutes later, raised questions about financial discrepancies, an issue I had carefully orchestrated by manipulating her company's internal accounts and leaving a breadcrumb trail that would lead straight to her. I sat back, sipping my coffee, as the notifications on my phone started to light up. Messages exchanged between executives, frantic phone calls, emails flying back and forth. The buzz of confusion and outrage was palpable even through the digital barrier. I could imagine the growing tension in the room as her superiors began piecing together the damning evidence, realizing that the woman they had trusted for years had been deceiving them. But the true blow would come when Ron, her lover, turned on her. I had planned for this, knowing that Ron's narcissism and desire for self-preservation would lead him to protect his own career at any cost. As soon as the accusations reached his inbox, I knew he would panic. The evidence I had planted was designed to suggest that Lauren had been manipulating company funds for their personal use, framing Ron in a way that made him look like a naive participant. Faced with the potential fallout, I knew Ron would abandon her without hesitation. I watched as Lauren's movements on my tracking app became erratic. She was rushing, probably pulling her phone from her purse, trying to understand what was happening. I could picture the confusion and panic on her face as she realized that the walls were closing in. There was no escape from what I had set in motion. The event continued, but the conversations were no longer about business or presentations. They were about Lauren, whispers spreading like wildfire as the evidence was shared among colleagues, the betrayal and scandal becoming the centerpiece of the afternoon. Her once perfect image, the polished, successful professional everyone admired, was being ripped apart piece by piece. Then came the final blow. At precisely 2:30 p.m., as Lauren was likely still scrambling to contain the damage, I triggered the final piece of the puzzle. I sent the compromising emails to a major client, one that Lauren had personally managed for years. The kind of client whose trust was paramount to her career and the company's reputation. The content of the emails, which implicated Lauren and Ron in personal misconduct and misappropriation of company resources, would ensure that the client severed ties immediately. I didn't need to wait long for the fallout. By 3:00 p.m., I received the first alert, a company-wide email announcing that Lauren had been placed on immediate suspension pending an internal investigation. It was swift and brutal, exactly as I had planned. The corporate world had no tolerance for scandal, especially one that involved such serious accusations. Lauren's career, the foundation of her identity, was now crumbling before her eyes, and Ron, he was nowhere to be found. True to form, he had distanced himself from her as soon as the accusations surfaced, likely claiming he had no knowledge of the financial discrepancies and insisting he had been manipulated by her. I had ensured that his betrayal would be the final nail in her coffin. By the time she returned home that evening, I was waiting. I heard her car pull into the driveway, the slow, hesitant steps as she approached the front door. I didn't need to see her face to know what had happened. The weight of her failure, her disgrace, would be etched into every part of her being. The door opened slowly and she stepped inside, looking pale and disoriented, like someone who had been stripped of everything they thought they knew. She didn't speak at first. She just stood there, as if unsure whether to come in or turn around and leave. I sat in the living room, the quiet hum of the television in the background, waiting for her to gather the courage to say something. But when she finally did, her voice was barely a whisper. "It's over," she said, collapsing onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. "Everything. It's all gone." I didn't respond immediately. I wanted her to feel the weight of her defeat, to understand the full magnitude of her downfall. She had betrayed me, and now she was paying the price. "They fired me," she continued, her voice shaking. I don't know how this happened. It's like everything just..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Her whole body trembled, her hands gripping the edge of the couch as if trying to hold on to something solid. But there was nothing left for her to hold on to. "They said I stole money," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They said I was involved in things I didn't..." "Ron, She couldn't even say his name without choking on it. I knew she had tried to contact him, to beg for his help, but he had already abandoned her. She was completely alone now, isolated from the life she had once controlled so effortlessly. "I don't understand," she said, looking up at me, her eyes hollow. "How did this happen?" I met her gaze, my face a mask of calm. "Maybe you should have been more careful," I said, my voice cold but measured. "Things catch up to people." Her eyes widened for a moment, as if something inside her had clicked, but then the realization faded, replaced by a look of confusion and despair. She still didn't know. She didn't suspect that I had been behind everything, that I had orchestrated her downfall with meticulous precision. She was too broken to connect the dots. That night, as she lay in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, I stood by the window, watching the reflection of the moonlight on the glass. I had won. I had taken everything from her, her career, her lover, her reputation. She was a hollow shell of the woman she had once been, and I had done it all without raising my voice, without so much as an outburst. I should have felt satisfied. I had planned every step of her destruction, and it had worked flawlessly. But as I stood there, the sense of triumph I had expected never came. Instead, there was only an emptiness, a cold void where my anger had once burned. Revenge, I realized, didn't feel the way I thought it would. I had destroyed Lauren, but in the process, I had become something else, someone I didn't fully recognize. The man who had loved her, who had built a life with her, was gone. What remained was a strategist, a manipulator, someone who had sacrificed his own humanity for the sake of control. As I looked at her lying there, broken and defeated, I wondered if it had all been worth it. The victory was mine, but the cost was something I hadn't anticipated. And in that moment, I realized that in destroying Lauren, I had also destroyed myself. I sat alone in the darkened living room, the weight of silence pressing down on me like a heavy fog. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, was now a hollow shell of what it used to be. Every corner echoed with memories I had long since buried, memories of love, trust, and a life I had built with Lauren. But that life was gone, torn apart by her betrayal and dismantled piece by my hands. My revenge was complete. Lauren was broken, her career in ruins, her reputation destroyed. The woman who had once seemed so untouchable was now a shadow of herself, isolated and defeated. Ron, predictably, had abandoned her the moment things had gone south, leaving her to deal with the wreckage of their affair alone. I had taken everything from her, and now she was left with nothing. But as I sat there, staring into the emptiness of the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within me as well. The satisfaction I had once envisioned, the sense of justice I had craved, felt hollow. The rage that had fueled me for so long had burned out, leaving behind nothing but an eerie stillness. I had won, but at what cost? I stood up and walked to the mirror in the hallway, the same mirror where I had once caught glimpses of the man I used to be, the man who had loved his wife, who had trusted her. The reflection that stared back at me now was different. I barely recognized the person in the glass. My face was calm, controlled, but there was something darker beneath the surface, something that hadn't been there before. I had become the architect of Lauren's downfall, methodical and ruthless in my pursuit of revenge. But in doing so, I had lost a part of myself. The man who had once been capable of love and forgiveness was gone, replaced by someone colder, more detached. I wasn't sure if I could ever go back to who I had been before. Maybe I didn't want to. The consequences of my actions weighed on me more than I had anticipated. I had destroyed Lauren, but in the process, I had fractured our home. Ella, my daughter, had been shielded from the worst of it, but she sensed the tension. She had become quieter, more withdrawn, her innocent world disrupted by the chaos I had created. I had told myself that my revenge was for her, to protect her from the lies and betrayal. But now I wasn't so sure. Had I really done this for her, or was it all just for me? The house was eerily quiet without Lauren's presence, but her absence didn't bring the peace I had hoped for. Instead, it left a void that I couldn't fill. I had wanted control, and now I had it. I had orchestrated every detail, manipulated every outcome, and yet I was left with nothing but a sense of emptiness. I thought about Lauren, broken and alone in the guest room where she now slept. She had tried to make amends in the days following her public humiliation, but there was nothing left to salvage. I didn't want her apologies. I didn't want her regret. I had wanted her to feel the pain I had felt, to suffer as I had suffered. But now that she had, it didn't make me feel any better. It didn't bring me the closure I had been chasing. I turned away from the mirror and walked back to the living room, sitting down on the couch. The house felt too big, too empty, as if the walls were closing in around me. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of what I had lost. I had gotten my revenge, but in doing so, I had sacrificed my own peace of mind. I wondered if Lauren ever suspected that I had been behind it all. Sometimes I caught her looking at me with a flicker of suspicion, as if she was trying to piece together the puzzle of her downfall. But she never asked, never confronted me. Maybe she didn't want to know. Maybe she was too afraid of what the truth would reveal. The days passed in a blur of routine, each one blending into the next. I went through the motions of life, but it all felt mechanical, empty. The satisfaction I had once imagined never came, and I was left to grapple with the consequences of my actions. I had built my revenge on the idea that it would bring me closure, that it would make things right. But it hadn't. In the end, revenge hadn't healed me. It hadn't filled the void left by Lauren's betrayal. It had only deepened it. I thought about Ella, about the future I wanted for her. I had been so focused on punishing Lauren that I hadn't considered the long-term effects on our daughter. She deserved better than this fractured home, this tension-filled silence. She deserved a father who could give her more than just bitterness and resentment. I stood up and walked to Ella's room, quietly opening the door. She was asleep, her small figure curled up under the blankets, her breathing soft and steady. As I watched her sleep, I realized that she was the only thing that still mattered. I had lost Lauren, but I couldn't afford to lose Ella too. I closed the door and returned to the living room, sitting down at the edge of the couch. I had won the game I had been playing for so long, but the victory felt more like a defeat. The man I had become, the man who had carefully dismantled his wife's life, wasn't someone I wanted to be anymore. As the night stretched on, I stared at the blank television screen, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I had destroyed Lauren, but in the process, I had destroyed something in myself as well. The cost of my revenge had been higher than I had anticipated, and now I was left with the aftermath. I looked back toward the mirror in the hallway, but I didn't get up this time. I didn't need to see my reflection to know what I would find. The man who had once stood there full of righteous anger and the desire for control was gone, and all that was left was silence.